They were supposed to be back by Sunday. On July 4, 1999, the Palmer family, Scott, 42, Dana, 39, and their two children, Alyssa, 11, and Ben, 8, set out on a weekend hike along the northern loop trail of Mount Rainier National Park, Washington. Experienced hikers and longtime Seattle residents, they had planned to camp one night and return the next. The weather was clear. Their itinerary was logged at the ranger station. But when they failed to return or check in by Monday, a search was launched. Helicopters scanned the terrain, dogs swept the trails, and over 100 volunteers joined park rangers in combing the mountain. Nothing was ever found. No tent, no gear, no footprints. It was as if the Palmer family had been swallowed whole by the forest. 25 years later, this mystery still haunts the Pacific Northwest. And now, as you listen to their story, let us know. Where in the world are you hearing this from? Drop your city and country in the comments. It's always moving to see how far forgotten stories can travel. Stay with us, because what was discovered 12 years later changed everything. Forensic teams arrived at Crescent Ridge within 24 hours of the discovery. What they uncovered was a shallow landslide zone, debris, compacted soil, and fractured stone, hiding more than just the backpack. Less than 5 meters from where the canvas was found, searchers unearthed the partial remains of a collapsed bivouac shelter, barely recognizable after 12 years underground. The metal frame was warped, the nylon shredded, but within the structure lay clear evidence of human presence: a melted portable stove, torn sleeping bag material, and the corroded barrel of a campfire ring. The journal recovered from the child's pack was sent to a conservation lab in Olympia. Miraculously, several pages were still legible. They were written in a child's handwriting, shaky but deliberate. The first dated entry read, "We went off trail because Dad saw something in the trees. Mom said we'd be fine." The entry was dated July 4, 1999. Over the next few days, more fragments were unearthed. A weather-worn hiking boot matching Scott Palmer's size, a watch with a cracked face stuck at 7:42, and a water bottle engraved with Ben's initials. But what disturbed investigators the most wasn't the presence of these items. It was their location. According to GPS overlay data and old trail maps, the site where the shelter was found was nearly 1.5 miles from the official trail, across terrain considered impassable without ropes. The question emerged immediately: why had a family with 2 children veered so far off course? Rangers confirmed that the trail junctions were well marked, and there were no weather events that day to justify confusion. It appeared the Palmers had chosen, or been forced, to leave the trail. An incident report filed by Park Ranger Miriam Holtz back in 1999, long overlooked, suddenly gained new relevance. She had written that a backpacker named Clay Dorsey, hiking solo at the time, claimed to have heard shouting near Crescent Ridge the evening of July 4th. He described it as a man's voice calling a name, then silence. Dorsey had notified the ranger station, but his report had been dismissed due to the overwhelming number of false leads during those first chaotic days of the search. Now, Holtz and a new investigative team tracked down Dorsey, who had since moved to Idaho. He remembered it clearly. "It was weird," he said. "Like someone was yelling for help, but didn't want to be heard." Then came another revelation. Among the artifacts pulled from the shelter, investigators found a second notebook, this one written in Dana Palmer's handwriting. Unlike her son's childlike observations, Dana's entries hinted at growing panic. In one, dated July 5th, she wrote, "Scott thinks we're being followed. I'm not sure if he's right or just scared. But the kids are frightened, and we can't get back to the trail. Something's not right in these woods." The second notebook was a game changer. Dana Palmer's entries, though sparse, revealed a narrative no one had imagined. Over the next few pages, she described strange sounds at night: snapping branches, heavy footsteps outside the tent, the feeling of being watched. "We heard something breathing just beyond the firelight," she wrote. "Scott doesn't sleep anymore. He sits up all night holding the flare gun." The entries became increasingly erratic over 3 days, alternating between hope that the weather would clear and terror that something, or someone, was deliberately keeping them from returning to the trail. Most chilling of all was a page dated July 7th. "Scott saw a figure again. I didn't. Alyssa says she heard it whisper her name." That was the last legible entry. The notebook abruptly ended there. For investigators, this information opened a dark new chapter. Had the Palmers encountered a threat on the mountain? Not environmental, but human? Or had paranoia and stress in the wilderness spiraled into a deadly chain of decisions? A new search perimeter was drawn. With the terrain now stable after the dry season, teams were able to safely explore previously unreachable areas beyond the collapsed shelter. What they found next silenced the camp. Roughly 200 meters from the shelter, buried under a natural rockfall, were 2 partial human skeletons. Based on clothing remnants and dental records, they were quickly identified as Scott and Dana Palmer. The position of the bodies indicated they had likely died shielding each other, or perhaps bracing against impact, but there were no signs of a fall. Instead, forensic analysis showed signs of blunt trauma inconsistent with natural causes: a cracked rib cage, a fractured skull, lacerations along the femur. The conclusion: they had been attacked. Possibly by a human. Possibly by more than one. The discovery sent shockwaves through local law enforcement and reignited public interest across the country. News outlets descended on Mount Rainier. Questions spread faster than answers. What had happened to the children? Why had no one found this earlier? And above all, who or what had been following them? Alyssa and Ben were still missing. Their remains had not been found. But the final twist was yet to come. A retired wildlife biologist living off-grid near the mountain reached out to investigators with something he had never shared: a videotape from 1999. It had been recorded on July 6th near Crescent Ridge. He'd been documenting marmot activity when, by accident, he'd captured a distant figure moving through the trees, and what looked like a child running behind them. The timestamp matched exactly with the missing days. The VHS footage was grainy, filmed on an old handheld camcorder with limited focus and sound. Still, the tape was carefully digitized and enhanced frame by forensic analysts. At minute 23:17, the camera pans across a ridgeline above Crescent Valley. For just under 6 seconds, a tall figure, unidentifiable in shape, wearing what appears to be a dark coat or cloak, moves slowly across a clearing. Just behind it, a smaller figure darts briefly into frame, wearing what appears to be a pale jacket and shorts. The child runs, stops, and turns toward the camera before vanishing into the trees. There's no audio beyond the wind, and the narrator discussing marmots, but the visual was enough to reignite every fear the Palmer family's disappearance had ever raised. Alyssa Palmer was last seen wearing a pale yellow windbreaker. The image matched. Investigators worked tirelessly to match the landscape in the video with current terrain. With input from the original biologist, drone recon, and GPS mapping, they pinpointed the exact ridge. What they found when they returned wasn't just wilderness. Tucked deep beneath the roots of a fallen cedar was a hidden, man-made dugout, reinforced with rotting beams, camouflaged with debris. Inside were remnants of food packaging from the late 1990s, wax paper, a child's sock, and 2 empty cans of beans stamped with a 1998 expiration date. It was clear someone had been hiding here, possibly for days, possibly longer. A small stone fire ring suggested this wasn't just a shelter. It had been lived in. But by who and why? Within hours, a forensic dog signaled nearby. Just 20 yards from the shelter, buried under layered moss and decomposed foliage, the final heartbreak emerged. The skeletal remains of a child, partially preserved. Clutched in one tiny hand was the broken frame of a plastic toy compass. DNA confirmed the identity. Ben Palmer. The body showed signs of starvation and exposure, but no violent trauma. He had survived longer than his parents, perhaps days, perhaps even a week, before succumbing alone in the woods. His final resting place was hidden, carefully covered, almost gently. Still, Alyssa was not there. As the public mourned the confirmed deaths and tributes poured in from across the U.S., a deeper question grew louder. Could Alyssa still be alive? The video evidence, the shelter, the absence of her remains, all left open the possibility. The case was no longer about closure. It was about pursuit. The FBI reopened the investigation under a new classification: possible long-term abduction and concealment. Then another voice entered the story. An anonymous letter, postmarked from Oregon and mailed to the Seattle field office, arrived with no return address. Inside were only 10 words, cut out from magazines and glued to paper. "She made it out. Stop digging. You won't find her." The letter threw the entire investigation into a new kind of chaos. Forensic analysis of the envelope revealed no fingerprints, no DNA, and the postage stamp was traced to a self-service kiosk in Portland. Impossible to track further. But the content was impossible to ignore. "She made it out. Stop digging. You won't find her." Was it a hoax? A threat? Or a message from someone who knew exactly what had happened? FBI analysts dissected every word, every choice of font and cut. Behavioral experts noted that the wording implied familiarity, not with the investigation, but with her. Whoever sent this letter claimed to know that Alyssa Palmer had survived. And just as chilling, they didn't want her to be found. The Palmer family's surviving relatives, still reeling from the confirmed deaths of Scott, Dana, and Ben, were thrown into agonizing uncertainty. Was Alyssa out there? Had she been taken? Raised under a false name? Did she even remember who she was? Media pressure surged again, this time with Alyssa's childhood photos beside age progression images created by forensic artists. News outlets aired retrospectives. Social media exploded with speculation, sightings, and conspiracy theories. But beneath the noise, a team of investigators quietly reopened every thread from the original 1999 case, including a name that had been forgotten. Harold Miner, a former park maintenance worker with a history of mental health issues and a reputation for living off-grid in the region. Miner had disappeared just weeks after the Palmers vanished. At the time, no link had been found. He'd been assumed a transient with no involvement. But now, with the discovery of the hidden dugout and the anonymous letter, his file was reopened. A surviving family member recalled that Miner once left a small carved wooden animal on their porch, a bear. It had seemed like a harmless gesture. But inside Ben Palmer's recovered backpack, investigators now discovered something eerily similar. A hand-carved bear figurine, worn smooth with time. The case escalated again. Photos of Miner were distributed across the Pacific Northwest. He'd be in his late 60s now, if alive. Tips came from Idaho, Montana, and even British Columbia. But nothing stuck. Still, the combination of hidden shelter, the letter, and the toy left one horrifying possibility on the table: that Alyssa had been taken by someone, and perhaps raised in secrecy, silence, or even manipulation for years. Then came the breakthrough. A librarian in Eugene, Oregon, reported something odd. A young woman, around 22 or 23, had come in repeatedly over the last year asking for books about missing children and memory recovery. She was quiet, polite, and never gave her real name. Only Lissy. Surveillance footage confirmed the resemblance: the facial structure, the dimple, the scar above her left eyebrow. It matched Alyssa Palmer's childhood injury from a bike fall in 1997. Agents were dispatched the next day, but when they arrived, Lissy was gone. She had left behind only one item, a dog-eared library copy of The Girl Who Lived Twice. Inside the cover, written in pencil, "I remember the trees. I remember Ben. I remember being found." The note in the book changed everything. For the first time in 12 years, Alyssa Palmer's voice, faint, fragmented, but unmistakably hers, seemed to reach back through the fog of time. The handwriting matched samples from her elementary school files. The phrasing, "I remember being found," struck investigators and trauma specialists alike. It suggested she hadn't been missing all those years, but hidden, and perhaps not against her will. Forensic psychologists were brought in to build a profile of what Alyssa might be like now. A woman raised in captivity, or isolation, possibly groomed to forget who she was, maybe even convinced that the outside world was dangerous. They called it identity suppression. And it meant she might not only be hiding, she might believe she had to. The library's security footage from the past year was analyzed frame by frame. Lissy always arrived alone, often near closing time, never using a library card, and always paid late fees in cash. In one video, she pauses in front of a missing persons board. She looks at it for several seconds. One poster, Alyssa's, was on that board. She stared at her own face, and then walked away. Authorities canvassed the area: homeless shelters, clinics, food pantries. The problem wasn't just finding her, it was approaching her without sending her into flight. In coordination with a trauma response team, a strategy was devised. A woman resembling Alyssa's mother, based on old videos and voice recordings, would be used to make contact gently, without uniforms, without pressure. It was a long shot, but they had no other. Then a local cafe owner called the tip line. A quiet young woman had been coming in every Tuesday morning for months, sitting in the same corner seat, always reading. One morning, after seeing news coverage of Alyssa's story, the cafe owner had placed a folded newspaper near her cup. When he returned with her receipt, it was gone. She had taken it. That was 3 days earlier. On the following Tuesday, the team went in. No badges, no confrontation. Just a woman in her mid-40s, sitting at the counter, humming an old lullaby that Dana Palmer used to sing, leaked from a home video to aid recognition. The girl entered, paused, looked at the woman. Her expression didn't change, but her hands began to tremble. She turned slowly to leave. The woman said one word, "Alyssa." The girl froze. For a moment, everything was still. Then she whispered, almost inaudibly, "That's not my name anymore." She didn't run. That, in itself, was a miracle. The girl, now a woman, stood still in the cafe doorway for what felt like minutes, her shoulders tense, breath shallow. Then, without speaking again, she turned back and sat down. She didn't touch her tea. She didn't ask who the woman was. She simply said, "If I talk, do I have to go back?" No one in the room knew exactly what she meant. Back where? Back to whom? But her fear was real, embedded in every twitch of her fingers, every glance toward the exit. A trauma counselor gently responded, "You don't have to go anywhere you don't choose." And with that, Alyssa Palmer, though she still didn't call herself that, began to unravel a story no one had imagined. She said she remembered the forest, the firelight, the nights they all slept pressed together to stay warm. She remembered her brother crying when the food ran out. She remembered her parents arguing in whispers. But then came the man. Not a name, just the man. She said he was kind at first, that he gave them crackers, that he told them the world below was broken and dangerous, and he would keep them safe, that he said they couldn't go back, not yet. And then one morning, her mother was gone. Her father wouldn't speak. Her brother got sick. And one night, the man told her to follow him quietly. She never saw her family again. The details were fragmented, like memories half remembered from a fever dream. But she remembered being taken to a house, small, dark, quiet. She wasn't chained. She wasn't beaten. But she wasn't free either. "He made the world small," she said. "He told me my name was gone, that the girl I used to be had died." She said she believed him. For years. Investigators pieced together the timeline using her statements, cross-referencing with missing persons reports and off-the-grid land purchases in rural Oregon. In 2003, she said, she remembered being left alone for longer and longer stretches. The man started disappearing for days at a time, and then one day, he simply didn't come back. She waited 3 more days. Then she walked to the nearest town and disappeared into the crowd. From 2004 to 2011, she lived under at least 3 different names, always moving. She worked cash jobs, stayed in shelters, read obsessively. She found the missing posters once, but didn't believe they were about her. "That girl was gone," she said. "I thought I was someone else now." She didn't fully realize the truth until she saw the toy compass in a newspaper article. That had been her brother's. That had been real. DNA testing would later confirm it. She was Alyssa Palmer. She agreed to return, slowly, on her terms. To therapy, not to the past. She asked not to be called a survivor, or a victim, or a miracle. "Just a person," she said. "One who remembers now." As the years passed, public fascination with the Palmer case slowly faded. The documentaries stopped. The articles dried up. New tragedies took the spotlight. But in some corners of the world, in cold case forums, in missing persons support groups, in trauma therapy circles, Alyssa Palmer remained a symbol. Not of survival exactly, but of something quieter. Of resilience without spectacle. Of living through the impossible and choosing not to let it define every breath afterward. Law enforcement kept her file open for another 5 years, hoping for a break in the search for Harold Miner. They never got one. In 2017, the investigation was downgraded to inactive, pending new evidence. Privately, some officers admitted they hoped Miner had died in the woods, never to harm again. Others feared he might have done this before, or might do it again. But Alyssa had made her stance clear. "I am not his ending. I am my own." She declined all offers to help raise awareness, to give talks, to appear on survivor panels. "I lived it. That was enough," she told one therapist. What she did instead was quieter, but more powerful. She began writing letters, not for the public, but for other families of the missing. Letters of empathy, not answers. Not "I know what happened, but I know how it feels to be left without knowing." Some letters she sent. Most she kept in a wooden box beside her bed. Her counselor called it grief folded into hope. There's one story, never confirmed, but quietly told by a shelter worker in Montana. A young girl newly arrived, scared, with no ID. One of the staff put on a documentary in the common room. The Palmer story came up. The girl froze, then asked, "What happened to her?" The worker replied, "She survived." The girl whispered, "Good." Then she smiled, just a little, and said, "Maybe I will too." Alyssa never heard that story. But maybe she didn't need to. Maybe the impact of surviving isn't about being seen, but about leaving a path behind, faint but steady, that someone else in the dark might one day follow. And every July 4th, she lights a candle by her lake. Not for tragedy, not for loss, but for the moment the trail finally ended, and a new one quietly began. The story of the Palmer family never had a clear ending. No courtroom verdict, no final confession, no neatly packaged justice. And maybe that's why it still lingers, not as a tale of mystery, but of memory. What happened on Mount Rainier in July 1999 shattered one family, shifted the lives of everyone who searched, and left scars across a landscape that looks peaceful to strangers but speaks differently to those who remember. The trail they took is still open. Hikers pass through each summer, unaware of what happened just beyond the bend. There's no plaque on the trailhead, no signpost of loss. Just wind in the trees and the sound of boots against soil. But if you walk far enough and quietly enough, you might notice a rock balanced carefully on another, out of place, or a hand-carved bear resting near a stump, or a child's toy, weathered and clean, tucked beside a stone. These are not artifacts, they're offerings, left by strangers who never knew the Palmers, and by a few who did. Because sometimes grief doesn't need a name to be shared. Sometimes survival, quiet and unfinished, is the only tribute that matters. Alyssa Palmer lives today under a new identity. Her location is private, her story no longer public property. But through the invisible threads that tie stories to strangers, she continues to exist. Not as the girl who disappeared, or the mystery solved, but as someone who endured. Someone who was remembered. Someone who, when the forest tried to erase her, held on to her name in silence until she could speak it again. And now that you know her story, maybe you'll carry it a little too. So tell us quietly, where are you listening from? What city, what country, what piece of the world now knows what happened on that mountain? Because stories like this only stay alive when they travel. And maybe one day, someone else walking a lonely trail will feel less alone, because you remembered.